Welcome to today's episode of the Normalized Surrogacy Podcast by Surrogacy Mentor. I'm your host, Carey Flamer-Powell, experienced gestational surrogate, surrogacy agency founder, and owner of Surrogacy Mentor, where our aim is to help surrogates match with reputable surrogacy agencies for a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey. Today, I'm happy to welcome our special guest, marriage and family therapist, Rachel Goldberg. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Excited to chat with you today about our topic, which is the perspective of intended parents in surrogacy. So before we dig into our topic, I do want to give a little information about Rachel. So Rachel Goldberg is a licensed marriage and family therapist, certified in perinatal mental health, who specializes in infertility and third-party reproduction. She conducts psychological evaluations for egg and sperm donors, gestational carriers, and intended parents. In addition, Rachel helps intended parents navigate complex decisions regarding third-party reproduction, providing emotional support and education throughout their journey. As a member of American Society for Reproductive Medicine and the Society for Ethics in Egg Donation and Surrogacy, where she serves on the newsletter committee, Rachel is deeply engaged in the ethical and relational aspects of family building. She also facilitates an ongoing support group for those navigating infertility challenges and provides care for gestational carriers and intended parents, addressing difficulties that may arise during the postpartum. In addition to her therapeutic work, Rachel frequently contributes to media outlets such as Women's Health, Vogue, Scary Mommy, HuffPost, and Today's Parent. She is also certified as a perinatal personal trainer and worked as a sign language interpreter during her college years. Wow, you have a lot of things on your impressive resume. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Well, welcome. So excited to finally connect with you and chat with you. So today we are going to talk about, this podcast is often focused heavily on surrogates. And, obviously that's my background as a surrogate and as an agency owner and now working directly with surrogates. So we do have some interviews with parents and things on the podcast, which has been great. But it's nice to dedicate an episode like this just to talking about the perspectives of what maybe intended parents go through on their end during the fertility and surrogacy process. So why don't we just dig right in? I have sort of an outline of some different subtopics that we want to look at in the intended parents' perspective. But essentially, why don't you just tell us a little bit about sort of the overall, as we're talking about this topic, sort of the overall perspective of why someone maybe is coming to surrogacy as a way to build their family as an intended parent.
So there's many reasons people come to surrogacy. Although it's gaining popularity right now in a lot of different areas for family building, really a lot of it is out of intended parents needing to come because they went through their own fertility challenges and wasn't able to do it themselves. But there's other reasons. So, for example, what's gaining popularity now, same-sex couples, who typically have always known that they need a gestational carrier if they want genetic ties. But there's also cases where there could be like a single man who wants to have a child, and also women who maybe knew all along they wouldn't be able to, or for whatever reasons have some kind of health reason that impacts their ability to carry. So this could be something like having to go through cancer treatments and maybe having a hysterectomy, or maybe even the chemo they went through makes it dangerous for them. Or someone could even be born with some kind of condition like not even having a uterus.
Right. And also, there could be, like you said, there's many reasons, but like what comes to mind also that's maybe not quite as common, but women who have maybe had a successful pregnancy in the past, but it was either extremely dangerous for them to get pregnant again, or it was miserable, meaning like they had, I believe it's pronounced hyperemesis serum.
Yeah.
The severe nausea where you're like hospitalized. So, I mean, it's possible that someone, didn't do surrogacy initially, but then realized if they want to continue building, they need to go to surrogacy.
Or even have a trauma after their birth where something had to be removed or there was excessive bleeding. And yeah, for sure.
Right. And like in my case, I carried for 2 women, and most people think, a lesbian couple, at least one of them can carry. And actually, no, one had a thyroid condition that made it very dangerous, and the other had a kidney transplant when she was 20. And there's no way she could carry. Right. So they needed someone to help. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons. And I don't think people think about that. Like, someone's not just coming to surrogacy out of convenience. Typically, someone's coming to surrogacy because it's a last resort after lots of failed tries on their own, and or it literally is their only option.
Right.
So, okay. So knowing that, let's sort of shift into kind of the perspective of intended parents from an emotional perspective. So as someone coming into this as a parent, knowing that you're going to literally entrust your child to someone for 9+ months, what's the emotional vulnerability required as an intended parent to trust this process?
And I think it's different from what your past looks like and where you're coming from. It's not always linear in the way that people come into it. So it changes their perspective also during it. For many, they come in with a history of infertility, loss, years of failed treatments. Some even come in needing to use a donor as well, which is an unexpected twist that wasn't part of their original plan when they thought, oh, I'm going to build a family. And I really can't emphasize this enough, but the emotional toll that fertility struggles take on individuals and couples is enormous. It's fueled by grief and anxiety, lingering shame, anger, envy, sometimes trauma. And then on top of that, surrogacy itself is incredibly vulnerable. And I think it's hard for the majority of people to comprehend what it must be to trust someone, as you said, to carry and care for the most precious thing, your future child. Intended parents are putting trust in someone else's body to protect their baby, and they don't have a lot of control over the process themselves. Yeah. And some IPs will handle this very well, whether it's because they've worked through their struggles or have always known that this was their path. But for others, the way they approach surrogacy and their relationship with the carrier can come across as aloof or overly controlling or even erratic. One moment they may seem enthusiastic and engaged, especially in the beginning when they're meeting and they're hopeful, and then the next it's more distant and withdrawn. The behavior is not ideal from a GC standpoint, and sometimes it's having to recognize that they're just protecting themselves or have already shut down after everything they've been through. It can be hard for them to really fully believe that this is something wonderful that's going to actually happen this time after years of disappointment. And I always try to help surrogates understand that when things aren't as picture perfect as they hoped, it's not necessarily that their IPs don't trust them, as best as anyone can really trust someone they just met, but also the stakes are incredibly high for them emotionally, financially, physically. They've lost trust in the process. And then this gets compounded when there's actually a loss, such as a miscarriage. It's complex because the surrogate is also experiencing a loss and feeling that they let their IPs down. And even when there is a great relationship and the building blocks have been put into place beforehand, situations like this are incredibly challenging because it's so individualized. And so even for a same-sex couple that came into this journey maybe with a lot of enthusiasm and just ready to have their family, and now they're starting to realize that actually things can go wrong. It's a sucker punch when something like this happens.
Yeah. I was recording another podcast earlier with an agency owner. We were talking about setting expectations for parents up front and how, she as an agency owner, me as a former agency owner, we tend to talk about the worst case scenarios up front so that it's not shocking when bumps in the road happen, because like you said, parents don't typically come to this process thinking about all the what ifs. And I think it's important to prep people appropriately. I don't want to scare people, but, at least be realistic with hey, this is not you sign up to get matched with a surrogate and everything's going to be amazing. This is human life. These are human lives. People have jobs and careers and marriages and all sorts of things that are going to affect this whole process, not to mention just nature and becoming pregnant and having a pregnancy, right? There's so much involved. There's so many layers. And I've often said, I loved being a surrogate, but there's no way I could be an intended parent. I don't think with my personality that I could trust someone else, my kid, which is such a weird thing to say as someone who was trusted with someone else's kid. Yeah. But yeah, it takes a lot of emotional vulnerability and courage to undergo a surrogacy process as a parent.
And really trying to let go and let the process unfold, which is incredibly hard for some people.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many layers there, which I'll say it a million times is one of the reasons why it's so important to have the appropriate mental health support for all sides in a surrogacy journey, because we don't know what's going to trigger what, right? During a journey, we don't know which loss or, just the stress or the financial pressure, which we're going to talk about here in a second. We don't know what's going to trigger someone to, like you said, go from being super attentive and engaged and excited to withdrawn and a little nervous and quiet. And how do you navigate that and make sure you have the right supports in place?
Right.
to make sure everyone has what they need, right? So I guess that's a good segue to the next topic of the subtopic, which is let's talk about the financial pressure. Like, it's no secret surrogacy is not cheap, and it's not getting cheaper. Fertility treatments and surrogacy process in general has only gotten more expensive since COVID, and I don't see that trend changing. So let's talk about what intended parents are undergoing sometimes to even be able to afford an attempt at surrogacy.
Yeah, it's exactly how you said it. Surrogacy is expensive, full stop. For intended parents, it's a life-altering investment. 6 figures here, there's medical bills, agency fees, legal costs, surrogate compensation. And then on top of that, some IPs are still paying off past fertility treatments. I've worked with couples who've had to take in second jobs, moved in with family, start GoFundMe pages, or made other significant sacrifices to afford surrogacy. And although people don't openly discuss this, money and emotions are always connected. So the financial strain adds layers of stress to an already intense process. There's this immense pressure for everything to go perfectly because they've invested so much. They don't want to seem demanding or ungrateful, but at the same time, it can feel unfair that the ability to have a family comes with such enormous financial hurdles. And this is especially true for same-sex couples who, for the most part, don't qualify for any kind of insurance coverage to offset the costs.
Yeah. And as someone who was married to a woman for 18 years, I am very strongly a proponent of making sure that same-sex couples can get access to the coverage that straight people have. It's definitely an inequity, and just by being a same-sex couple, you're going to need some form of intervention / donor / surrogate to have a family. My ex-wife and I had to have a sperm donor, and that was unavoidable. It's just the way it had to be, right? So I think it's important for people, for surrogates specifically that are listening, to understand that even though the media may try to tell us differently, it's actually not a bunch of celebrities and ultra wealthy people that are the majority of the intended parents in surrogacy. When I was an agency owner for 6 years, most of the parents I worked with either mortgaged their homes or had multiple family members who helped them to a point where they could even try to do surrogacy. And just so we're very clear, it's multiple hundreds of thousands, typically a minimum of $150,000, if everything goes great. Usually I tell people to plan for about $200,000. And when you're talking about international parents, that's US dollars. So if you're talking about someone who lives in a country where the US dollar and their dollar are very different, to them, that could be equal to like $300,000 or $400,000 US dollars. So it is a huge undertaking, as you said. And most of the time, the people that I've worked with personally have had to piecemeal lots of things together, just like most of us would have to if we had $150,000 to $200,000 expense. We'd have to take a loan and have some family help and take a second job. Maybe if we have a home, mortgage it, and then maybe we'd have enough, right? That's no different. I would say my estimation, 80% at least of intended parents are in that situation.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's such a good point because the media portrays it as the celebrities, they have the money, clearly, but the majority of people, they're scraping by completely.
Yeah. And the insurance that you brought up, the coverage, whether that's health insurance covering the embryo creation process or whatever it is, that's a huge chunk. And that for the people that have access to either the insurance coverage or some sort of reimbursement program, which is becoming much more common these days as Gen Z is moving up in the workforce, fertility benefits are becoming a huge thing that people are looking for, and rightfully so. We don't live in a country with universal health care or universal reproductive care. And so it's important for people to understand that very, very few people in the United States have access to any kind of reimbursement or coverage when it comes to this process. It's almost always completely out of pocket, unfortunately.
Yes, fair.
Yeah. So that it's a good example. When you were talking, it made me think it's almost like this is the biggest gambling bet of their life. And it's almost like going, I've never been to a track, but going to a racetrack and putting down $200,000 and being like, that's literally all the money I have that I could collect from 5 different sources. And if it doesn't work, I'm out, right?
And then also if they want a sibling journey too, if you want more than one child and this is your only option, where are you going to come up with that kind of money?
Right. Yeah. Let alone starting your family, let alone building it. That's, continuing to build it. It's a lot. And so I don't think it can be discounted when surrogates are thinking about the perspective of the parents and what led them to this point. Don't underestimate that financial pressure and that financial hurdle that a good 80% plus of parents have to overcome. So yeah, I think those of us that are in the industry, working behind the scenes, involved in different organizations, one of our biggest things is hopefully contributing in some way to finding ways to make this more financially achievable for more people. And that's a long project. But it's something that all of us on the professional side are very keenly aware of and are working towards. So let's shift gears a little again and talk a little bit about, so we talked a little bit about emotional disconnect versus the over-attachment, but do you want to touch on that a little bit more? What do you mean by disconnect versus over-attachment?
It's so individualized. So some IPs, they seem very enthusiastic at first, but as the pregnancy unfolds, they may become more emotionally distant. Maybe they don't ask as many questions as you'd expect, or they aren't as involved in the details. And it's really not because they don't care. As I mentioned before, it's often just self-protection. They're guarding themselves, especially if they've experienced loss in the past. I remember one surrogate sharing that she thought her IPs didn't care because they rarely asked questions or got excited about milestones. But when she ended up talking to them, she learned that they were just terrified of letting themselves believe it was real. So they might be keeping a little emotional distance just to help manage the fear of what can go wrong. They also may pull back because they don't want to feel like they're putting undue pressure on their surrogate. They hear about that and they don't want to be that person. And if you really think about it, when two strangers are brought together to navigate one of the most vulnerable experiences anyone can go through, it's not going to be seamless. So when we hear about IPs and their gestational carriers becoming best friends, it sounds like this dream. But overall, I think that's more of a rarity, or at least if it does happen, it's more of a temporary bond born out of this unique bubble that they're living in during the process. And then on the flip side, you might have IPs who are very involved, sometimes to the point where it can feel invasive. They may constantly check in, ask for updates, or make suggestions about everything from nutrition to birth plans. For example, an IP who's worried about what would happen if their surrogate had to make a big medical decision in an emergency. And so then is constantly checking up on their GC and wanting to know their whereabouts or wanting to track them on their iPhone. So it's not necessarily always about mistrusting the surrogate. It's about learning to let go of control after years of micromanaging every detail they could in their fertility journey. For a gestational carrier, though, this level of involvement is understandably very overwhelming and even frustrating. And I think that it can help some surrogates to remember that most of the time it's coming from a place of fear, grief, and a deep desire to feel connected. And, IPs aren't the ones carrying the baby. They may look for other ways to feel close to the process. And unfortunately, that sometimes does come across as controlling. So it's one of those give and takes where it's hard to navigate it. And you just have to try to be very patient with the other person.
In my experience, I found that not always, but in the majority of cases where there was an over-attachment or, sort of an overreach by the intended parents, it was international parents because they feel so physically far removed, not only from the surrogate, but culturally, right? Particularly if we're talking about completely different cultures, like maybe Chinese intended parents versus American surrogate. There's so many things that we do in our cultures surrounding pregnancy and birth that are so important and so different that it can seem really odd for someone to be concerned about something that you've never even thought of, like drinking cold beverages while pregnant. That's something in the Asian culture. Most pregnant women do not drink cold beverages. It has to do with their beliefs around qi and just physical health, right? They believe in warm beverages during pregnancy, especially. And so we've had surrogates with Chinese parents say like, what? I can't have my iced coffee or I can't have my tea or it's summer, I'm 8 months pregnant in July in Arizona and I'm going to drink ice water. So we have to sort of explain cultural differences as well sometimes, but have found that sometimes it's about addressing, is this a value? Is this a fear? Is this wanting to be more connected? Or, what is it? And then let's address it from that perspective. And some are easier than us, but yeah. I think
Yeah,
that's
really communication, so key. Just opening up the dialogue.
Right. And I think also a lot of that can be hashed out in the match.
Yeah.
Like, what are the things that are culturally important to you? Or what are the things you're most worried about or most looking forward to? What's the level of communication you want to have during this pregnancy? What does an ideal communication schedule look like? Right. And also, as you were talking, it made me think, like, regardless of where the parents are, who they are, this is their quote unquote pregnancy, in the sense that they're not carrying it, but this is the 9 months, 10 months that they're going to look back on when the child is 10, 11, 12 and say, while the surrogate was pregnant with you, this is what we were going through or doing, or this is what that experience was for us. And so it's important for them to feel like they're connected and experiencing things in a way that provides them, like, I don't know how to say this, but like gives them the experience, at least some of the experience they were hoping for, whether that's milestones, appointments they can be in on, things
Connection.
that help.
They want to
connect to the memory of it, because this is the only time they're going to get to go through a pregnancy, albeit in a completely different way than they probably had hoped. Oh, that's good information for everyone, I think, to have. So now let's talk about after the birth, right? So you've done this big thing, you've, mortgaged your entire life to get to this point, and now you finally have your baby, and you've had this, let's just assume, a great relationship with your surrogate, and everything's gone great. We've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about what the surrogate goes through, having been the center of everyone's attention for typically almost 2 years at this point. Then now all of a sudden, all the attention's on the baby and the family, and she's left to go back to her normal life. Let's talk about what the parents are experiencing during this transition.
Yeah, so for the IPs, the moment their baby is born, it's absolutely life-changing. It's an overwhelming mix of joy, relief, fear, gratitude, but it also comes with these unexpected feelings like guilt that they weren't the ones carrying their baby, and a lot of fear over will they bond, and then maybe even guilt about leaving the surrogate behind as she recovers. And the reality is now they're parenting, right? So it's a big shift for them to go from intended parents, planning, waiting, and then suddenly now they're parents. So they feel unprepared sometimes, or worry that their baby isn't connecting as quickly as they'd hoped, or is missing the surrogate. These are things that people don't talk about unless really they're in therapy, but they're concerns that people really do have. Some may fall into a depression because up until now, they've just been caught up in the whirlwind of fertility treatments and the surrogacy process. They never really had time to process it, or didn't take the space to do that, and now it all hits them at once. With the GC, it's also a bittersweet time, because obviously they know that their GC was essential to making this happen, and they're filled with gratitude. And while some IPs will have every intention of maintaining a relationship, that connection can easily fall by the wayside as life with a newborn takes over. Others, they may want to sever ties, not because they're ungrateful, but feel they need a clean slate to start their new chapter as a family, or they're international and it's just not convenient. It could feel like a very strange time between the relationship, because there's often an unspoken question of, so how do we say goodbye, or how do we keep this connection going in a meaningful way? It's undoubtedly a joyful time, but it's just layered with so many emotions, with extra people involved that usually are not involved.
Right. Yeah. And, the things you were talking about in the beginning with, maybe feeling like, not worried about connection or worried about bonding or all of those things. I think every parent worries about those things, whether you carried the child or not, right? Like, you worry about connection, and am I going to bond with my baby? And, am I feeding them enough? Am I feeding them well? With an intended parent, it's, I'm not providing. Well, maybe some intended mothers are doing breastfeeding, but for the most part, I think most intended parents either get breast milk from the surrogate or formula, and they're probably like, am I feeding them enough? Am I giving them the right nutrition? And you're just worried about all these things, and that's just universal to parenting, right? So I think hopefully intended parents listening give themselves a little bit of a break, because this is just normal stuff you worry about as a parent. Take off the intended parent word. It's just parenthood worries, right? But there is that extra dynamic of now this relationship with the surrogate, and what does that now look like going forward? And I interviewed one of the moms that I cared for recently, and she said, when we were in the hospital, we had our hospital room next to you after the delivery, and we didn't know if we should bring him over to you, or if that would be hard for you, but we didn't want to keep him from you if you wanted to see him and you were recovering. We know if we should bother you, but we wanted to see you. She's like, we just were we wanted you to just take the lead because we didn't know what you needed from us. And so it highlights for me, like, we all are just going through this universal adjustment of parenthood, whether you gave birth, didn't give birth, whatever. It's an adjustment, right?
Yes. It's such unknown territory and it's so individualized. And I love what you said, which is true for intended parents. I see postpartum depression and fears about bonding and why am I not bonding with people who gave birth. But the thing is when you are an intended parent, you think it has something to do with that. It makes sense, but I always try to reassure them that this is the case for many people. It has nothing necessarily to do with giving birth or not giving birth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot to adjust to, no matter how you came to have this child. It's a lot to adjust to, for sure. And it doesn't always go the way the movies say it's going to go, right? Yeah, for sure. So having learned, all of these different perspectives of intended parents and, what led them to surrogacy, what they've gone through during the process and after the birth, what are some tips that you might have for surrogates that are listening or watching that want to know how can they better show up for their intended parents, or at least keep in mind their perspective, or what can they do to make this process easier? We talk a lot about what intended parents can do to make the process easier for the surrogate. And I think reciprocating that back to the parents is important.
First, patience and empathy go a long way. Remember, if an IP seems overly anxious or cautious, it's really coming from a place of fear and not that they're not grateful or trusting of you. I also think this is why it's so important to have a joint meeting between surrogates and IPs in the beginning, because a therapist can open the conversation about the types of things the IP has been through and their fears, which not only helps the GC understand the emotional space their IP is in, but also creates a bond through the vulnerability during the session. So I think for a GC to acknowledge their intended parents' feelings and show they understand can be incredibly reassuring. And then second, communicate openly. A lot of tension can happen when there's a mismatch in expectations, like how often to check in, what updates they want, or how involved they'd like to be. It's always okay to set boundaries, but talking about them early can avoid misunderstandings. And then also talking about them along the way and not letting them fester into resentments. Any good agency we know can navigate this really well so that things don't escalate, but you have to also speak up. And then finally, you want to celebrate together, but try to match the IP's lead. So milestones like ultrasounds or even small moments like feeling the baby kick can mean the world to the IPs. And so if you notice they're enthusiastic, then match that. But if they are more neutral or cautious, maybe don't send gifts of happy children jumping up and down for a milestone. I would say try not to take it too personal if right after they seem dismissive or just not as interested. I know that happens sometimes and I wish it didn't. And I understand how hard that may be for a gestational carrier, but also the IPs are incredibly overwhelmed and sometimes they just forget their manners. So I think just in asking a lot of questions and seeing how they respond to the questions. If they're answering very enthusiastically and really excited, then great, match that and keep asking questions. And if they're not, then back off and give them a little bit of space. But also this highlights the importance of having a support person in your own life as a surrogate, because if the intended parents aren't going to be the cheerleaders, you want to have your cheer squad with you.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say, like, this is a good point to mention. Like, if you get to a point where the communication isn't what you'd hoped or something's feeling off, this is a good time to either lean on your support network or your agency coordinator, or your mental health person, to sort of help you get perspective. And if there's truly an issue, bring hopefully you together with the intended parents and get you back on the same page. So hopefully you have that support system in place with your agency and your mental health person and your support network so that communication never gets too far off track and you feel like you're in a good collaborative relationship with the intended parents.
Yeah, because in the beginning, they might all say that they want the same thing, but then things change and maybe they change their mind or they don't want it as much. I always try to remind both intended parents and surrogates it's okay to say something has changed or that you want something different. There's always a way to make it better, but you have to communicate.
Right. Yeah. I was just talking with another agency owner about we're all human, right? And so things are going to change and happen in our lives. Like the surrogate, she's going to change. Her body's going to change. The way she feels physically is going to change. That's going to change maybe her reactions or her, the way she responds to certain things. Maybe one of her kids gets sick. She's got extra stress on her with that. Same thing on the parent side, right? God forbid, maybe they're married and they get divorced, or they're going through marital issues, or one of them loses a job and now the financial pressure is like 100 times worse. So like many things can happen because we're human and life happens. And we just have to hopefully form enough of a communication bond in the beginning and a good support network around them that whatever those bumps and hills and valleys are, they can be supported through it and get through it together.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. So any last minute advice or tips you'd like to give people about intended parents going through this process?
Just to remember that they are very grateful, even though sometimes it doesn't always seem that way. They really, really are. Even when the communication broke down, they always preface it with, I am so grateful. But they are very grateful.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and sharing your knowledge and experience with us on this. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Normalized Surrogacy Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Carey Flamer-Powell, and I want to again thank my special guest, Rachel, for joining me today. You can learn more about Rachel via the links in this podcast. Be sure to check out surrogacymentor.com and take our easy 2-minute quiz to see if you might qualify to be a surrogate. Subscribe to this podcast to learn more about gestational surrogacy and how to have a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey. Talk to you next time.